Systematic Theology Volume 2, The Works of God. Robert W. Jenson. New York, Oxford. Oxford University Press, 1999. Preface. The volume here offered is the second of two. Certain peculiarities of the work's general organization suggest that a few paragraphs of renewed orientation may be useful. The entire first volume was devoted, after Prolegomena, to the doctrine of God. Several traditional topics that in most systems appear later under other headings appeared already in that volume. According to a conviction systematically determinative for the present work, Christology, pneumatology, and the soteriological interpretation of Christ's life, death, and resurrection belong to the telling of God's own story. Now in this second volume we come to the works of God ad extra, as the tradition has labeled them, though the phrase is here understood somewhat less expansively than is traditional. We come to acts of God directed to a reality other than himself, considered thematically in their otherness, and so to the doctrines of creation, of the church, and of the final kingdom. It must be admitted that the distinction between these matters and those chosen to be covered in Volume 1 is at some points tenuous, but organizing the work on the plausible principle that finally all Christian teaching in one way or another tells God's own story would of course have obliterated the point. The order of this volume's parts among themselves is a matter of tactics. Each of their 6 possible combinations would have its conceptual and expository advantages. I simply decided, after making the rather drastic changes in familiar order that shape Volume 1 and its relation to Volume 2, to abide for the rest by more accustomed sequences. Thus in Volume 2 we follow what is usually taken to be the natural sequence of the Bible and the creeds, misleading though also that assumption can in some ways be. I should here, between the 2 volumes of my work, confess an increasing awareness of indigence. Martin Luther's farewell says it all, wer sind Bettler. Das ist Verum. Writing Volume 1, and then reading it, has insistently shown me how much I have left out or not understood. The truth of the gospel is simple and mind-boggling and above all abundant. Everything I have read or heard since beginning to write, and every moment of reflection, has revealed some new matter or consideration or contention that demands to be included in this book but cannot be if I am ever to finish. Since a preface can be revised until the last minute, I can mention as example an event that happened when I thought I was done with ecclesiology. Blanche Jenson and I spent 10 days in Helsinki with the theologians there, with Tuomo Manama and his associates, and I came back realizing that I had to rewrite and expand much of the part dedicated to it. Thus every day it has become clearer to me why the Kirchliche Dogmatik and the Summa Theologiae are so long and even so were not finished. It has been my doubtless superficial determination to be brief, relatively, and, God willing, to finish. That you are reading this tells you that I have been and that he has been. Finally, early in the first volume I remarked that it is the fate of every theological system to be dismembered and have its fragments banded in an ongoing debate. I intended the remark as an offering of my own system for such treatment. But in the time since, I have become more aware of how thoroughly this work dismembers its predecessors and uses the fragments in strange ways, and of the offense and puzzlement this can be for disciples of, say, Thomas or Barth or Palamas or Luther. I can only say, sorry. But that is how it goes. When mere humans try to do theology. Part 4. The Creation. 15. The act of creation. 1. The Bible begins with a straightforward doctrinal proposition: in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. Genesis 1 verse 1 should be so translated, since it is, almost certainly, to be read as the caption of the following narrative, both summarizing and introducing it. The proposition became a rule of faith in Israel. A text from 2 Maccabees is often cited: look at the heavens and the earth and acknowledge that God made them. The primal church simply maintained the Jewish doctrine. Indeed, even maintained is too energetic a verb. In the New Testament the doctrine is not so much asserted as assumed and used to warrant other assertions. Thus the missionary proclamation cited in Acts story of Paul and Barnabas at Lystra includes their confession that Israel's God made the heaven and the earth and the sea and all that is in them, not for its own sake but to show wherein the gods of paganism, who make no such claim, are by contrast unworthy of worship. Or again, the passage in Hebrews, by faith we understand that the worlds were prepared by the word of God, interprets not the worlds but faith. The New Testament does make one new assertion about creation, that it is done for the sake of Christ, and so, since he also antedates it, through him. But also this teaching is in direct consequence from Judaism. Contemporary Judaism, fully in accord with Genesis, as we shall see, taught that it was for us that you created the world. The Church, in its claimed continuity with Israel, appropriated also this aspect of Jewish teaching: the world was made for the Church's sake. When Christ appears in Colossians as mediator and goal of creation, it is as the head of the Church that he has this position. One passage both gathers many aspects of the primal Church's belief and has a more deliberate dogmatic ring. Against polytheism, Paul cites a Christological expansion of the Jewish confession of one God: there is one God, the Father, from whom are all things and for whom we exist, and one Lord, Jesus Christ, through whom are all things and through whom we exist. Yet even here Paul's purpose is not to enforce the idea of creation itself or to develop it Christologically, but to ward off any temptation to take the pagan God seriously except as occasions of temptation, since all real things but the biblical God are his creatures. All alleged gods other than the one must be either figments or, if real, then creatures who pose as gods and so become demons. From about the middle of the 2nd century the situation changed, as the Church confronted Gnostic and other modes of denial that the being responsible for this world deserves to be called God. Mediterranean paganism in its decadence experienced the world in the way Martin Luther would reduce to a famous dictum, that one who observes the actual management of this world and judges by any usual moral standard must conclude either that God is not or that God is wicked. The escapes available to paganism were nihilism, stoic resignation, or a desperate hope that the power responsible for this world is not truly God. Only the last default could tempt Christians theologically, so Justin Martyr contended with Mark Ion, who, says Justin, taught that we should think of another God, the God revealed in Christ, as greater than the Creator. This conflict was one of those in which the Church was moved to its 2nd and 3rd century proliferation of rules of faith and creeds. Therefore, confession that the God revealed in Jesus and the Creator are the same, now indeed made for its own sake, is a staple of these formulas, regularly appearing as the first doxology of the Father. So, the rule of faith given by Irenaeus in the 2nd century, the Church has received the faith from the apostles and their disciples, in one God, the all-ruling Father, who made heaven and earth. Notably, these doctrinal statements reiterate the biblical and Jewish proposition with little or no conceptual elaboration, against directly contrary views current in the culture. 2. Plainly, our next task must be to inquire what God creates means in Scripture, since the Church's doctrine simply appropriates the biblical proposition. Lexical investigations are here of little help, because Scripture reserves the verb translated creates, bara, for this one use. Creating is something only God does. We are directed to context. Fortunately, this is all we need, since the meaning of God created in Genesis 1 verse 1 must in any case be determined by the narrative that follows. Developing the concept of creation by exegeting the Genesis account is of course no new strategy. We will proceed through a series of propositions, in this and the next sections. The first proposition, that God creates, means there is other reality than God and that it is really other than He. The most obtrusive feature of the priestly creation narrative is the drumbeat rhythm of the 6 days. Indeed, this is the chief means by which this subtly reflected document, the product of a rhetorically sophisticated theology, does its teaching. Primary among the insistent rhythms is "and God said, let there be, and there was," with its variants. The point needed and needs such insistence. In the world's religions, the dominant understanding of our being and the being of our world is that it derives from deity by emanation of one sort or another. By this interpretation, either there finally is no reality other than the divine, or insofar as it is other, it is illusion or degradation. We should note that modern secularist interpretations of the world's derivation do not break this pattern but merely exacerbate either the world's divinity or its worthlessness, or in postmodernism both at once. Once the Church was thoroughly involved with various versions of this interpretation present in the Gentile world, it became difficult also for the Church to resist it. The Arian controversy itself was a narrowly successful struggle to expel antique paganism's emanationism from at least the Church's innermost Christological thinking. The emanationist temptation has continued throughout the Church's history. I will note only 2 instances. For at least the Western Church, the teaching of the Fourth Lateran Council of 1215 may be taken as the dogmatic definition of creation. There is only one true God, the one principle of the universe, creator of all things visible and invisible, who by his almighty power simultaneously at the beginning of time made all creatures from nothing, whether visible or corporeal, angelic or earthly. Definition was found necessary because of Platonist thinkers who blurred the distinction of God and creatures, and reappearing Gnostic groups who regarded the otherness of creation as evil. And at the time of this writing, academically and church-politically powerful feminist, womanist, Muellerist theology oddly supposes that any dualism of God and creature is patriarchal. Proposition 2. There is other reality than God because He speaks. The rhythm has a second beat. God said, let there be. The motif of world origin by making, direct or delegated, is clearly present in the priestly writer's conceptual repertoire, but in the canonical text is subordinated to creation by speaking. By the time of our text writing, it was a rule of faith in Israel, by the word of the Lord the heavens were made. For He spoke, and it came to be, He commanded, and it stood firm. God, we must formulate, speaks the world into being. The notion that God or the gods evoke other reality by speaking is not in itself unique to Israel. What is particular to Israel is the sort of word God speaks to bring the world to pass. He issues a command. Nevertheless, given the theological history, we need to linger with the sheer notion of creation by word. Theology, we have seen, has often failed to understand the logos as God's utterance and has substituted the notion that He is God's concept. The logos is said to proceed from the Father as the Father's act of knowing Himself. Creation through the logos is then interpreted as an immanent act of the Father's will, to actualize ideas that belong to what He knows in knowing the Son. In knowing Himself in the Son, God knows what He can do, including what He can initiate other than Himself. Thus he knows the possibilities of creatures as these are ideas in the divine self-concept. Creation is then the decision that all or some of these be instantiated. This theologumenon stems finally from Origen's pioneering speculations and is appropriate in some contexts. But as the primary description of how God creates, it subverts Genesis' account. It has even been argued that it displaces Christ from his New Testament role in creation. Not the person Christ has the function but Plato's ideas, relocated in a mind of God that only after the fact is identified with Christ. Of classic theologians, it is perhaps Martin Luther who most straightforwardly corrected the usual interpretation. Commenting on Genesis, he reports the ordinary exegesis and rejects it as at odds with its text. Then he proceeds. Moses uses the term amar, which simply denotes the spoken word. By a mere word that he speaks, God makes heaven and earth from nothing. This exegesis includes a decisively biblical understanding of the Logos himself. Even the word that is in the divine being is an uttered word by which something is ordered and enjoined. God's act to create is certainly an act of intellect and will, as the majority tradition has said, but it is the kind of such act that is not enclosed within the subject but takes place as communication. Already the word that is a triune person is God's utterance in his triune life. In the first volume we belabored this point. Now we must further insist, therefore the word by which God creates is not silent within him but is his address, and is creative in virtue of the specific character of this address. Thus we arrive at our next proposition. This is, God commands the world to be, this command is obeyed, and the event of obedience is the existence of the world. A second subrhythm of our passage is, God said, let there be, and there was. It is this character of God's creating utterance that is peculiar to Israel. God creates the world by utterance of a moral intention for other beings than himself. Why will they existed and were created. Thus his creating of the world is agency of the same sort as the Torah by which he creates Israel. Here too we may note Luther's exegesis. Already the divine thought that remains in God but is nevertheless a distinct person is an inner command. It is then by this uncreated word that the created word is evoked, the created word of obedience and worship that every creature is, and to this last contention we must of course return. Israel understood the reality of the world on the pattern of her own reality, just as she depends on the Lord's moral utterance, so does the world. A psalm evokes the parallel with all desirable clarity. He sends out his command to the earth, and his word runs very swiftly. He makes his wind blow, and the waters flow. He declares his word to Jacob, his statutes and his judgments to Israel. Both the creation and Israel lived by every word that comes from the mouth of the Lord. That Israel interpreted the world and its origin on the pattern of her own self-understanding is nothing peculiar to Israel. All cultures have seen the universe in their own images and its foundation in the images of their beginnings. What is specific to Israel's understanding of universal origins is not this general pattern but the material understanding of her own reality that Israel in fact has. A fourth proposition, all the preceding holds in the present tense. Stories such as Genesis 1-11 tells are here as elsewhere etiological. They are told to certify life and the world as we now find and live them. In Genesis, they are indeed meant to be taken realistically as narratives of past events, but their purpose is still to illumine permanent structures of life. This holds also for the first of these stories, the story of creation. Therefore there is a sense, treacherous though its assertion has often been, in which Genesis makes the world's dependence on God be independent of the difference between one moment of created time and another. The world would not now exist did not God now command its existence. Again we may cite Luther, this is what the philosophers do not know, that all perdurance is wholly from the power of the Word of God. A distinction between creation and preservation or between initial and continuing creation has been rightly used to warrant that there was a first existence of creatures at a 0 point of time. But such distinctions can have no other metaphysical or religious significance. The world is no less dependent on God's creating word in any moment of its existence than it was at the beginning. God's creating word no more waits upon its auditor now than at the beginning. Thus Thomas Aquinas set his discussion of preservation under the motto of Hebrews 1:3, he sustains all things by his powerful word. Then he defined, God's conservation of things is not by any new act, but by a continuation of the act by which he grants them being, nor is this continuation either a process from or a temporal elongation of the creating act. Whatever difference the existence of creatures, once they are there, may make to God's continuing creative work, their role cannot make his command any less immediate now than in the beginning. So Philip Melanchthon, God is present to his creation, not as the God of the Stoics, but as a free agent sustaining his creature. Two recurring problems of the theology of creation emerge from the foregoing observations. The first, it has often been supposed that the doctrine of creation is a part of Christian teaching shared with the otherwise unbelieving. Recently this has just as generally been denied. But there must be a moment of truth in the former opinion, for all cultures do in fact tell just such primal etiological stories as appear in Genesis 1-11, and around much the same set of motifs. How are we to understand this? What is common to all the race, and emerges in the need to tell etiological stories of primal times, is, we may suggest, a set of worries. Thus the fragility of the physical circumstances in which human life is possible is felt by all cultures, and stories are everywhere told about the bare aversion of universal catastrophe. Or again, encounter with peoples whose speech cannot be understood is always a threatening puzzle. In Israel, as elsewhere, stories like those of Genesis 1-11 are told to bring such anxieties to word and so make them bearable, that is, to certify reality as it is now experienced. Among the universally felt fragilities of existence, one is metaphysical. Not only is our human world ambiguous and threatening in certain dominating but contingent features, so also is the precondition of our human history, the world in its mere givenness prior to all our action in it. There is a sort of absolute worry. We have already cited Heidegger citing Leibniz. Why is there anything at all? Why not just nothing? The ambiguities of such things as diverse languages or the perennial conflict of herdsmen and cultivators can be illumined by stories involving human actions and motivations. The problematic character of the world as such cannot, since the world is the presupposition of all human action. Therefore it is not so much fragility or ambiguity that must here be grasped as it is mystery in the full sense. To bring the mystery of the world's existence to a narrating word, we are compelled to make logically odd narratives, that in one or another way begin, when everything was still nothing, to recount the beginning of a connected series of events. We have to start by telling how things were at that beginning, and just so make some reference to the state of affairs before it, but in the present case the beginning to be recounted is that before which there was no state of affairs. Genesis begins its narrative in just this peculiar way, with its second verse. The oddity of narrating an absolute beginning raises the second problem: can such a narrative be truly historical? Can the fact stated by God creates the world be an event and sequence of events? Must not the proposition, despite its form, instead be read as the statement of a timeless relation? The great mythic stories of origin cause no problem here. Myths intend not to narrate any particular events but rather to evoke something that happens in all events, and they show this by the rhetoric of their storytelling. The origin they tell is logical and ontological, not temporal. Is not then the story in Genesis after all to be read as myth? There has been continuous pressure on Christian theology to read it that way, whether or not under the overt label. Origen, for example, was clear about what the Church taught and about what he therefore wished to teach. First of all, that God is one, who created and ordered all things, and who when there was nothing made the universe to be. But in the course of explicating the doctrine, he describes God as intrinsically creative power, and then sees a puzzle. For to think that such divine power was ever idle would be absurd. This seems to demand that God always creates, and therefore that there always are creatures. Origen pondered a variety of ways in which there could always be a world even though the world has a beginning, and to his usual credit seems to have been satisfied by none. Through the history of theology, whenever the mutual definition of time and eternity by mere negation has reached Gnostic stringency, Origen's argument has reappeared, often in nearly his words. Thus the 19th century mediating theologian Richard Roth, if one thinks of creation as having a beginning, one must think of God as not being creator before the advent of creation, which contradicts the concept of God. And indeed, unless the love out of which God creates is the specific inner triune actuality of the triune God, if it is a simple unitary love for creatures, then creation must be eternal. Since the love is. In modern theology, the pressure to think of creation as a standing relation has perhaps intensified. The recent process theology offered an instance of simple capitulation. The tendency is opposed by our fifth proposition: the creature, simply in that it is creature, has an absolute beginning. Genesis story is not a myth, for it does not in fact tell us anything about what things were like when there were no things. Its tohu webohu is not an antecedent nothingness actuality like the great slime dismembered by Babylonian Marduk, nor yet an eternal egg or womb or pure potentiality of primal matter. The fathers were clear about this, the heretics say, but there was also the darkness. Over the deep. Again, new occasions for myth. The deep is not a fullness of antithetical powers, as some fantasize, nor is the darkness an original and evil force arrayed against the good. Genesis reference to emptiness and formlessness, and the darkness and waters of chaos, is not to a presupposition of creation but to the inconceivable beginning of creation, made inconceivable by the absence of presuppositions. Augustine reads Genesis precisely: "You have made all times, and before all times only you are, nor does time antecede itself." Were the nothingness of Genesis 1 verse 2 a describable antecedent of creation, then God's act to create the world would be like Marduk's of victory over this nothingness or, as in other myths, its impregnating or digesting or other action upon it. But although the language of the myths provided Israel with literary and perhaps ritual motifs with which to celebrate creation, and doubtless stands genetically behind some of Genesis imagery, the mythic assertions themselves are avoided, since a jealous God can brook no competitive primal powers. At the beginning of creation there is nothing and the Rosh of God. If this phrase were to be translated, wind from God, as some modern versions do, again the narrative would be mythic. But in translating so, the translators show their prejudice for what a piece of language may have meant before its canonical placement. Whatever may have been said or meant in traditions from which the priestly writer drew, it is quite inconceivable that the shapers of the canonical text, at their theologically sophisticated time in Israel's history, can have written Rosh Elohim and not clearly intended God's Spirit, nor do we here have any reason to take earlier stages of tradition for our object. Does Genesis then teach the dogmatic tradition's creation out of nothing, ex nihilo? Judaism anyway read it so. The passage cited earlier from Maccabees continues, and not from anything. This exegetical tradition too was continued by the Church. The Maccabees passage or its source seems in fact to be quoted, if with antique freedom, by one of the earliest known rules of faith: first of all believe that there is one God who made the universe to be from not being. Such language then appears in Irenaeus, Origen, and others. According to Genesis, at least as Judaism and the Church have read it, before there is the creature there is God and nothing. Nor is this nothing of a kind that can be the antecedent condition of something. God speaking is the creature's only antecedent condition, as Philip Melanchthon formulated: when things were not, God spoken they began to be. 3. Proposition the sixth: reality other than God not only has a beginning but also has an end, in that it has a goal. Also, this end must be either nothing or God. And the end, unlike the beginning, might indeed be a sort of real nothing, a nothingness. Creatures once given, it would not violate the difference of creator and creature to think of creature's end as entry into a sort of created negativity, into what Karl Barth untranslatably called das Nichtige. But the end cited in Genesis is not das Nichtige, for in Genesis, being is good, and the creature has being. This is established by another beat of the narrative's insistent rhythm. If God said is the downbeat, then it was good is the upbeat. The word that creates, we have noted, is a command, it aims at something. And the Creator not only commands but judges that the command is obeyed. In Genesis, God's judgment that the creature is good belongs to the story of creation itself. Creatures exist in that God determines that they are good. Hebrew tav, like English good, suggests good for, it works within a framework of purposes. Thus, according to Genesis, creatures exist in that God finds them good for his purpose with them, which of course means that he does have a purpose with them. Why is there anything at all? Genesis' answer so far may be stated: the world is in that it is commanded to be, and in that its obedience is accepted by the speaker as serving the intent of his command. Moreover, it is also clear what, according to Genesis in its canonical placement, the world's purpose is. Israel made and used etiological primal stories in her own way. Israel's way was to tell them within a total narrative whose determining event is not itself a primal event but an event within history, the Exodus. The genealogies of Genesis, the first of these, is exegetically difficult. Probably the best interpretation reads the Hebrew usually translated image simply as counterpart. In any case, the text provides its own commentary with the other two specifications. Humans are to exercise dominion among the creatures. That is, they are to be the Creator's representatives to his other creatures, and in that sense to be his counterpart. Most decisively, God does not merely establish this dominion but does so by addressing them. The impersonal blessing of fertility turns in their case into a personal speech of commission. The Creator begins a conversation with these new creatures, and so they are his counterpart. Humans, we may say, are those animals whose creation is not merely that God speaks about them but that he also speaks to them. Humans are those creatures who exist in that they are mentioned in the triune discourse and are called to join it. Humans are those creatures who not only exist by words that state God's moral will, but are given to hear and reply to those words. We may turn to Peter Brunner, whom we have cited at decisive junctures before, in that God in the creation of man addresses him as you do. God opens a history with man that is constituted by the address of God and the answer of man. And we must, of course, return at length to these creatures, that is, to ourselves, so boring to modern readers, belong to the very point of those chapters. They establish the continuity of events from the beginning to Abraham and the other patriarchs. But already the patriarchal story is, as we have noted, a prelude. The patriarchal history tells how God was the God of Israel before there was Israel. Before God created Israel by deliverance from Egypt, Israel pre-existed in God's promise that there would be Israel. The history of Israel's own coming into being is a history of promise, of the leapfrogging succession of promise, fulfilling, or penultimately unfulfilling, event, and new promise. It is into history so conceived and told that Genesis incorporates also the beginning of the world. What Israel certifies for the present by its story of the universal origin is the universal scope and unconditional validity of Yahweh's promises and of his faithfulness to those promises. The Lord can keep the promises he makes because all things are his creatures and so in his hand. So Jeremiah, at a time when this faith was severely tested, the idols of the nations are worthless, a work of delusion. Not like these is the Lord, the portion of Jacob, for he is the one who formed all things, and Israel is the tribe of his inheritance. Or we may say, what the creation narrative certifies for the present is the universal scope of the Exodus. There is, Genesis claims, nothing more ontologically fundamental than this event. Or again, the resurrection having occurred, the Church goes on to say that what the creation narrative certifies for the present is the universal scope of the resurrection. For Paul it is a single concept that God gives life to the dead and calls into existence the things that do not exist. Thomas wrote the beautiful sentence, "In God's hand were all the ends of the world. When his hand was opened by the key of love, the creatures came forth." If only it be always remembered that God's love is triune and so spoken, that is the whole truth of this chapter. A seventh point gathers up those made so far in this section. The world God creates is not a thing, a cosmos, but is rather a history. God does not create a world that thereupon has a history. He creates a history that is a world, in that it is purposive and so makes a whole. The great turnings in God's history with his creation, at the call of Abraham, the Exodus, the crucifixion and resurrection and the final judgment, are not events within a creation that is as such ahistorical, they are events of the history that is created. Even the biblical account of the absolute beginning is itself a narrative. the 6 days of Genesis do not recount first an absolute beginning on the first day and then what happens to the creation on subsequent days. The whole story of 1 week tells the one absolute beginning. The beginning is not accomplished until the works of the 6 days are there. The loss of this insight is the great historical calamity of the doctrine of creation. And it is indeed the loss of something once possessed, for near the beginning of theology Irenaeus of Lyon cast a grand vision in which initial creation and redemption and fulfillment were dramatically united moments of God's one creative work, shaped and moved by his one intent to save. But thereafter the doctrines of creation and redemption were developed with less and less reference to one another, and the notion of a total dramatically unified divine action was obscured. Perhaps the key diagnostic question is whether redemption is understood to fulfill initial creation or merely to restore it. Theology has too much tended to the latter. 4. Observation 8 must be the haste with which Genesis moves from the sheer Big Bang to the creation of living beings and its then lavish expenditure of days on their sequential creation. The biblical doctrine of creation is centrally a doctrine of the creation of life, of beings which, as the standard modern definitions have it, maintain themselves by metabolizing materials from their environment and reproduce their like. That is, creation is imperatively directed to those creatures that are teleological in their own being, that manifest and are sustained by striving, by pursuit of a determinate end. The world is not a dead apparatus in which a few living beings happen to find themselves, it is a garden and pasture of living beings, which the cosmic and atomic and chemical systems make possible, and this is true even if the tiny speck Earth is the only home of life in the vast system. The canonical text of Isaiah preserves explicit doctrine from the days of Israel's greatest theological consciousness. A gloss on the prophet's proclamation lays down 2 propositions in immediate succession. The first, he did not create it a chaos, it has purposeful order. The second stipulates that purpose, he formed it to be inhabited. Genesis then ontologically distinguishes one set of living creatures. In the 6th day, the rhythm is broken. After the land animals are in place by a command and verification on the usual pattern, an additional action is announced with a portentous new locution, let us make. This out-of-rhythm act is the creation of humanity, male and female. The priestly narrative gives this creature 3 distinctions. Humans are in the image of the Creator, they are to have dominion over the other creatures, and, as emphasized in an earlier connection, the Creator does not merely create them by His word but turns to address that word directly to them. These out-of-sequence creatures remain creatures. They are made on the same day with the other land animals, to whose general sort they thus belong. Even the address that God makes to them begins as a blessing of animal fertility that repeats one given earlier. Genesis locates their distinction not in elevation beyond the status of creature, nor even in endowments of their species, remarkable as these may turn out to be, but strictly in the 3 marks noted. The first of these is exegetically difficult. Probably the best interpretation reads the Hebrew usually translated image simply as counterpart. In any case, the text provides its own commentary with the other 2 specifications. Humans are to exercise dominion among the creatures. That is, they are to be the Creator's representatives to His other creatures, and in that sense to be His counterpart. Most decisively, God does not merely establish this dominion but does so by addressing them. The impersonal blessing of fertility turns in their case into a personal speech of commission. The Creator begins a conversation with these new creatures, and so they are His counterpart. Humans, we may say, are those animals whose creation is not merely that God speaks about them but that He also speaks to them. Humans are those creatures who exist in that they are mentioned in the triune discourse and are called to join it. Humans are those creatures who not only exist by words that state God's moral will, but are given to hear and reply to those words. We may turn to Peter Brunner, whom we have cited at decisive junctures before, in that God in the creation of man addresses him as a Euclidu. God opens a history with man, that is constituted by the address of God and the answer of man. And we must, of course, return at length to these creatures, that is, to ourselves.